Hello, my name's Tracy Plough, and my apologies that I'm not here with you today for the conference. I think my circumstances have been explained to you, but thank you nevertheless for still inviting me to present to you remotely. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing landscape around digital communications in the higher education sector. My own background, I've worked in the higher education sector now for about 15 years, mostly here in the United Kingdom. I used to work at the University of Warwick, in-house in the communications team there. I then became head of a service called Research TV, so I was responsible for a lot of research communications through broadcast mechanisms for a number of different universities around the United Kingdom and the European Research Directorate. And since setting up my consultancy in 2007, I've worked with about 140 different education institutions, of which about 80 or 90% of them are higher education institutions and business schools, in about 20 different countries to help improve digital communications and online marketing activities. So the perspective that I come from today is really from the marketing and communications perspective and not from a pedagogical sense. I'm not a teaching and learning expert, but I have a very strong belief that we're really seeing a significant movement towards the merging or the need to merge between how we think about our teaching and learning applications and our engagement with our current student body with how we think about our marketing and communications and advocacy type activities as well, which is often one of the core things that we need to achieve from our digital communications. So we're going to talk about digital strategy and we're going to reflect on it from three different perspectives. We're going to think a little bit about what the challenge is now and what the challenge is ahead for us. We're going to think about the role that content strategy plays as a potential hook to form a solution for our digital strategy and how we evolve that. Content strategy is really the underpinning thing that we absolutely have to do in order to join our digital strategy together. And yet, it's a piece that is often missing within most institutions that I work with. So to start with, we're just going to reflect a little bit on the landscape now within higher education. Normally when we think about digital strategies, the way in which we approach it, there are three different ways in which we often think about digital strategies, particularly from a communications point of view. The first is that we will think about our digital strategies from an organisational point of view. That's to say that we look at the individual teams and objectives that those teams have, whether it might be the research office or a teaching and learning team or a marketing and communications team or a business engagement team, for example. And we look at the digital needs of each of those individual teams and those individual objectives that they have. And we kind of look at them very much in silos. And it means that we often implement digital products and approaches that don't necessarily connect all of those different worlds together. And yet the content that we're dealing with often requires that we do connect them together in order for us to form efficiencies and better communications for our users and our audiences. The other approach that we see quite often when it comes to thinking about digital strategy is a platform-based approach. So we see a particular digital product or an evolving area of digital communications and we say we need that platform, whether it's a social media platform or a technology solution such as a virtual learning environment. And we commission and we implement those platforms, but we treat them quite often as individual platforms. So it means that our platforms and our technologies don't always connect together in the ways in which they could do, they should do, and which we really ought to strive towards in order to get the greatest efficiency out of the work that we're trying to do. The last scenario that we see, and this from a communications perspective and a user perspective is often the best, is that we see an approach that focuses on journeys as we prepare digital strategies and digital communication strategies in particular. So by that, we look at the journey that a user takes in order from initially becoming aware of our institution or our business school, or even having an aspiration that one day they might do something that could lead to them forming a relationship with our business school. For example, having an aspiration to one day study for an MBA. And we look at how the digital technologies and digital engagement opportunities play a role throughout that journey. That's often the ideal scenario because what we're doing there is we're ignoring our organisational silos and we're Also ignoring the individual parameters that different technologies present to us, and we're weaving those together around an experience that makes sense to the user or the audience member. The problem what we have with that is that organisational silos often do still come into play. So we will quite often have the team that looks after the pre-student experience, marketing, recruitment, admissions team, the people who look after the experience of engaging with students, for example, when they become part of our communities, a student communications officer, the tutors that teach them, a programme director, and then the people that nurture and support those relationships after that person has left that formal connection with our institution, the alumni relations and development team, for example. And those still fall into those organisational siloed structures. So we still get that organisational problem coming into play, even when we look at digital communications from a journey perspective. But we're being presented right now with a number of challenges in terms of the way in which digital communications is evolving, alongside that, of course, the ever-changing landscape of higher education and business studies as a wider discipline. So we need to reflect on what these challenges are and how they're going to impact on us and what they mean for us in institutions. So I've outlined 7 different areas that I'm going to talk through now and share these with you and reflect on them a little. And then we're going to move on to think about how content strategy plays a role in weaving some of this together for us. I'm going to talk about these in a reasonably light touch way, but it's worth pointing out to you that I also wrote an article for Case online earlier this year about digital trends in 2017, of which I speak about these 7 areas that I'm about to speak now. So if you want to read up on this again, take a look at it more, you can go to this link here and you can read a little bit more on what I'm about to say about these different 7 areas that we'll reflect on. So the first kind of emerging area of digital technology that we need to be aware of is this trend towards live experience. And we're seeing this come about through developments in technology such as Facebook Live, Instagram Live, Snapchat Stories. There's this real pressure for us to be creating content for our audience that's about the now, it's about the immediacy of that. And a lot of that content only lasts for a very, very short period of time. For example, on Snapchat, a story will only last, or an item in a story will only last for 24 hours. Instagram is moving towards curated experiences that, again, will only really be seen for 24 hours on the platform. So this challenges us to think about our content in a slightly different way. We need to think about what creates a good live experience, and for me that often goes beyond just grabbing a camera and recording something that we already have going on, like a public lecture or an open day. It requires us to do something a lot more with that. Just to give you an example, in Newcastle upon Tyne, where I live in the northeast of England, a couple of years ago, when Periscope launched, which is a live video platform, around about 20,000 people sat and watched people walking or trying to walk through a giant puddle that had emerged in the city, and someone had set up a camera and was filming it. This is not the kind of content that we're used to dealing with. It's not the kind of content that we feel comfortable producing within business schools and the wider higher education sector. But this is the kind of thing that people want to watch, so it requires us to think about content in different ways. We need to really engage with live experience technologies to think about creating bespoke experiences for those technologies and not just filming the experiences that we currently have taking place on our campuses and within our business schools. So, for example, we might, instead of recording an entire public lecture, we might grab the speaker for 5-10 minutes perhaps, or maybe even shorter, maybe even just 20 or 30 seconds, and record an interview with them and get some sound bites from them, rather than recording the entire public lecture. And it requires us to ask ourselves questions around the value of our content. If this content is only going to be online for 24 hours or less, or even only seen for 10 seconds or less, do we want to store that content, or are we happy for that content just to dissolve into the ether, and what are we going to do with that content? So thinking about things in new and different ways in terms of how we interact our technologies with the live experiences that we have within our schools. The next trend that we're seeing is a trend towards what we refer to as multi-format, or you might think of it as multimedia publishing. And this is being driven by platforms like Facebook that are preferencing new formats in terms of how we tell our stories. And I'm just going to play you a portion of a select video about this now.
Today, almost 1 billion people will visit Facebook to check out what's happening in the world around them. Most of them will come across articles in their newsfeed, shared by their friends and their favorite publishers.
And one of the huge issues we see is how long it can take for those articles and news to load, which we know on phones is a really big deal.
If you're trying to convince somebody that bees are worth their time, you don't want a loading bar to get in their way.
Just in hallway conversation about the media, we feel like if you don't have somebody in 10 seconds, they're out. Probably actually less than that.
That's why we built Instant Articles, a new way for publishers to create fast, interactive articles on Facebook. So when you tap on the article, it loads instantly.
This is a living page. This is a living, breathing article that is beyond just words.
The video autoplays and allows you to tell the story in a more visual and more animated way.
Being able to watch a video seamlessly, I think it's actually really refined here, and it's kind of a beautiful experience.
For years, I've used a gatefold where you open it up and you see more of the image. Now the phone can kind of be a digital gatefold where you see a slice of the image and you move it right or left to see the rest of the image.
It's really going to help solve some of the problems we've had with bringing pictures that we think work really well in the magazine environment to the phone.
Audio captions let you hear the voice of the author while you're reading the story.
A syringe drops a small amount of pesticide on a sedated honeybee to test its effects.
There's a really cool animated map so that you're actually floating above the area like you're in some spinning helicopter.
You can zoom into a map on where that picture was taken. That's really cool and incredibly, it's a layering of information.
So I'm just going to stop it there. You can watch the full video if you wish in your own time. The slides will be available for you. But what we're seeing here is this storytelling approach and the way in which we engage with our audiences, that it requires us to pull together different types of media and different formats. And Facebook within their algorithm will preference this kind of content to appear in people's news feeds. So if you're creating content in these formats, it will be more likely to be seen by your audiences. But this requires us to plan and be creative in slightly different ways. It requires us to think as proper storytellers, and it requires us to coordinate between the different skill sets that we have within our institutions for producing these different pieces of content in different ways. And those skills don't always exist within the same team, within the same units within our institutions. So we need to think about that, but we also need to think about how we can use the assets, the digital content that we already have available to us. So this places a new demand on us as well for thinking about asset management, digital asset management, how we really capture and understand the content that we have available in any different format, whether it's text, image, video or audio. There's also opportunities here when we think about these formatting techniques to think more about personalisation. How can we change and tell a story in a different way for a different type of audience in different formats? And this is something we're going to talk about a little bit more in this presentation. The other trend that we're seeing at the moment is a real boom in artificial intelligence technologies and a move towards these starting to serve a real purpose in our life, although some of them are still a little bit questionable. So we know about these technologies through things like Siri on our iPhones, and we can ask Siri things like, where can I study electrical engineering? But we can see it gets very confused. It starts to give me results that are all about electrical engineer technical type support services within my local areas rather than courses about electrical engineering. So what we're having to do here is also think not just about the results that we are serving to people and how we ensure that our results are the ones that come up high in the search results here, but also how our audiences ask the questions that may drive them towards us. So here's me trying a different form of that question. Who offers a degree in arts management? And then here we start to get some more relevant search results come up. So we need to be thinking a lot more inside our audience's heads in terms of what are the questions they're actually asking, and how can we use artificial intelligence platforms to be able to serve those responses to them in the correct way. It's not just things like Siri, but it's things like the Google Home or the Amazon Echo. It's forcing us to think beyond the rectangle of a screen. It's forcing us to think about the experiences and the interactions that people have with our institutions actually in 3 dimensions. It's about voice communications and voice interactions, and not just something that we look at on a screen. So this is also challenging us to think about things in new ways and thinking about how we tell those systems what the content that we create actually means. So if I ask one of these systems, where can I take part in sport on campus? It might serve me a number of different results. It might serve me, here's the BSc in Sports Science, here's the Sports Centre on Smith Street, or I don't recognise a sport called on campus if it's playing up a little bit. What we need to think about is how we can use semantics to really tag up this type of content so that when the question is asked, the right answer is given. So we need to think about how we categorise our content in a lot more depth now. So for the first of these answers, we might want to give this a category of programme. For the second of the answers, it might have a category of venue that we're talking about. And for the third of these answers, the category might be activity, because what it thinks we're talking about is a sport itself. So we need to think about how we mark that content up in a way that's more meaningful. Artificial intelligence is really evolving, and at the moment we're in a stage where we have to really think about what those interactions might be and really plan them out in quite an individual level, whether we're thinking about chatbot type experiences, which of course can deliver us all kinds of efficiencies in terms of our customer service type approaches, but also can cause us problems in that it doesn't feel like a human experience. But the technology is evolving quite significantly, and I'm just going to show you a video that's not about a chatbot experience or about human interaction, but shows just how far this technology is progressing.
Hi, I'm Yatam. This is an experiment called AI Duet. It uses machine learning to let you play a duet with the computer. Making music using code isn't a new thing at all, but machine learning gives us a different way to go about it. If I was trying to make AI Duet with more traditional programming, I'd have to write out lots of rules, like if someone plays a C, maybe respond by going up to a G. Or if someone plays 3 ascending notes, then maybe go back down. I'd basically be creating this map to tell the computer how to make these decisions, but there are just too many note and timing combinations to map it all by hand. This experiment approaches the problem differently, using machine learning, specifically neural networks. We played the computer tons of examples of melodies. Over time, it learns these fuzzy relationships between notes and timings, and builds its own map based on the examples it's given. So in this experiment, you play a few notes. They go to the neural net, which basically decides, based on those notes and all the examples it's been given, some possible responses. I had some friends try it out. It was fun to see how it responds to different things people play. It picks up on stuff like key and rhythm that you're implying, even though I never explicitly programmed in the concepts of key and rhythm.
So again, I'll stop that there and just reflect for a second. We're not at the stage in higher education where neural networks are really going to play a significant role in the next couple of years in terms of us being able to use artificial intelligence in our communications. But it's coming and it's evolving. But the first step is that first step that he spoke about, where you play the note D and the note C follows. We need to think about our communications in those terms as well, in terms of planning for that, for how we can potentially implement things like chatbots to be able to use technologies to create better efficiencies for us without removing what feels like that human element and the benefit of a human conversation within there. All of this really is moving us towards personalisation, and that is also what marketing automation technologies are trying to do to us, or do for us, which is the next piece that we'll talk about here. So marketing automation technologies look at a user's behaviour online, look at what they're clicking at, look at the types of content that they're engaging with, and serve up to them different, more bespoke types of content that align to what their interests appear to be. We already see something similar to this happening within most social media platforms, particularly within platforms like Facebook, where they look at your behaviour, they look at what you like and what your interests appear to be, and they prioritise content that is similar. Of course, there are wide ethical, moral and particularly political discussions about this as to the impact of it and the effect that it has on society and on our own awareness of the world from an individual perspective. But this can be useful, particularly in a marketing context. So when someone comes to your MBA program and we see that they're clicking on the module quite a lot that's about marketing strategy, or perhaps the module that's about tax advice, then what might happen is that we can design that and determine so that when they next receive an email communication from you, it flags up the latest blog article about marketing strategy or about tax. So it means that we can personalise the communications that we send out to people based on the behaviours that they display within our websites and our different technology platforms, based on what they click on within the email links. So what it's given us is an automated kind of semi-personalised response. It's a little bit like the stage before artificial intelligence, and we can kind of plan that and program that in particular ways. But in order for us to do that effectively, we need to really have advanced audience research, the kind of levels of audience research that we don't really have in higher education at the moment. We need to really, really understand inside our audience's minds in a much different way. We need to understand their needs, their motivations, and their behaviours in a very different way. And we need some proper content modelling here, and this is where we think about our content as blocks of information and not just pages of information together, in order for us to be able to pull that information together in different ways and configure it in different ways for different audiences, depending on what their interests might be. We'll come to that a little bit more in a second. So personalisation is a theme that I've spoken about a couple of times here. And one of the things that we see quite a lot when institutions think about personalisation is they approach it from a perspective that's actually more about the organisation than about the audience. So we need to be asking ourselves the questions, when we're doing personalisation, is it about them, our audience, or is it really about us? When we approach personalisation from a perspective that's about us, it's generally very process-driven. When we approach personalisation from a perspective that's about them, that's about our audience, we need to look at it from a perspective that's driven by values and the interests of our audiences. So a process-driven method of thinking about personalisation looks at things like, and this is thinking very much about the student recruitment cycle, but looks at things, for example, like the admission stages that someone is at. Are they a pre-applicant? Are they an applicant? Have they accepted? Have they paid their fees already? Are they just about to start their programme? And we personalise content according to those stages. The other way in which we might personalise those content is around their demographics. So we may decide that we're going to provide different content to someone who is an international student than we may provide to someone who is an Australian home student, for example. Or we might provide different information to different regions of the country as well, different states. With this, we need to be really careful that what we're not doing here is slipping back into that stage of providing, of just pushing on people our organisational structures again, and the content that is aligned to those structures rather than to meaningful insights for the audience themselves. It doesn't give a lot of consideration for their individual motivations. And we often need to ask ourselves the question, are we just doing this and structuring our content in this way just because it makes our lives a little bit easier as an institution, rather than necessarily making the lives of our audience easier? So if we move to a system where we look at values and interest-driven approaches to personalisation, which is the more ideal scenario, because here we're really, really providing a personalised experience that aligns to what is going on in the minds of our audiences, then what we're asking ourselves are, what are their triggers? What really, really matters to them? What are they really motivated by? Are they interested in sport? Are they interested in cricket in particular? Are they really deeply interested in finance strategy? Are they really interested in organisational change and innovation? What are the things that really matter to them, and what's really drawing them potentially to you as an institution? And how can we then serve back content that relates to those personal interests that they have? And we can look at that through their behaviours. What have they clicked on your website? But it means that we need to craft that content in the first place in a way that almost lures them into the particular traps that we will set that tell us what are their interests, what are their motivations, what were they interested in. So to do this, it means that we need to develop a new approach to thinking about our personas. We need to stop thinking about them as demographic buckets of people and start thinking about them as groups of tribes, if you will, as motivation-driven people. So for some people, the motivation for studying an MBA might be career advancement. It might be that they absolutely know what that next step in their career needs to be and they want it to be, and that's exactly what they're working towards. For another person, it might just be that they're looking for a life change, or they're looking to experience living and being in a different country. I might think of those people as being slightly more driven as an explorer or an adventurer. So the types of content we deliver to them might be very, very different. And it requires us to plan our content in a very unsiloed way and to really work across our institutions. The next area of digital evolution that we're really seeing really come into the mainstream now is what I refer to as blended realities. So we can think about this from being virtual reality technologies, which have been around for a while, but now the price point of the devices that we need to have in order for us to have a virtual reality experience has fallen significantly. Or augmented reality experiences. The phenomenal success of Pokemon Go last year was a really good example of augmented reality experiences that people are having, where we're taking a real life scenario and we're layering digital content over that scenario through often a mobile device. So we need to think about how these come into play. The other area of evolution in this is 360-degree video technology, for example, which I'll show you an example now.
This lab was one of the most exciting investments that I think Boston College has made. I'm Ethan Baxter. I'm a professor here in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at BC. I'm the director of our brand new Clean Lab facility in Tim's facility, and I'm an isotope geochemist. TIM stands for Thermal Ionization Mass Spectrometer. One of the systems that we're working on right now is reconstructing the cycling of water and carbon dioxide.
So what you can see there is me moving the screen around, me looking at that video from a 360-degree perspective. What we don't know is where the user is going to look. What are they going to be looking at? So when we're recording these 360-degree videos, we need to be aware that the reality that people have is going to be different from each person. Everyone is going to see a different story, essentially, with that. So for us to respond to these within our digital strategies, we need to think about our content production capabilities within our institutions. Virtual reality is really cheap from a user's perspective now. It's as cheap as a few dollars to buy a Google Cardboard, which you slot your phone into and it becomes a virtual reality headset. But the expense and the investment in this is actually in the production side of things. It's not cheap to create virtual reality content in the first place. So we need to think about our capabilities for doing this. We need to think about how we model for these different views and scenarios that people might have through augmented reality or 360-degree video. And we need to think about the conversational interface design elements of this, which also plays back to what we were talking about with artificial intelligence and marketing automation as well. And we need to ask ourselves the question, is it actually worth it, or is it just a gimmick? So the next thing we need to think about then is interoperability. This plays into the development of different systems and different technologies and how we need them to work together. We have a lot of systems within institutions that tend to drive different things for different objectives for us, and they don't always work together very well, and it means that we're in danger of replicating content, duplicating work and effort for people. A really good example of this is academic profiles, for example. I work with universities all the time that might have 3 or 4 different systems for inputting information about an individual academic. There might be the research database that logs all of their papers and their citations and their research projects. There might be the experts directory, which is designed for press and media, but it's a completely different system that journalists can search. There might be their individual program pages within the institution's website, which could be designed only within the content management system for that website and completely separate to the other systems. And we've even been working with a university recently that also has another system that is primarily just for being able to for people to search for a PhD supervisor, another system altogether. So those 4 systems require the academics to input content in 4 different times. Well, technology and the opening of APIs within technology really should enable us to be able to get our technologies to work together and talk to each other better. But in order for us to do that, we need to understand what we want that content to do and how that content actually connects together. This is a really, really simple example of 2 technologies working together. This is for a conference that I'm currently organising. So this was the speaker session proposal for the conference. We had on our WordPress website for the event a form that people could fill in, but we had made that connect to our internal project management system so that when that form was filled in, it automatically appeared within our internal project management system for the conference with an ability for us to be able to vote on it and comment on it so that we could select our speakers. That happens automatically because the APIs between the 2 platforms can talk to each other. But we knew what we wanted it to do from a content perspective. What we're really talking about here is the need for us to model our content in different ways and to think about our content as individual blocks of information, not a page of just content. So in this scenario, imagine that what I'm showing you right now is a web page. So at the top you might have a header, a subheader, an image with a subtitle, a block of introductory text, a paragraph of main body text. One of those blocks at the bottom might be some contact information. But what we need to do is break down what our content is into these individual components so we can start manipulating them and using them in different ways, making them connect together in more meaningful ways. One of the impacts of that is that we can personalise that content more. So we can say we want the top header to stay the same, but actually for a different audience, we want the subtitle to change. We might want one of the images to stay the same, but one of the images to be different. And we might want our introductory paragraph to be different for different types of audience. Or we might want to use that content and reformat it into some completely different purpose. So this, for example, might be a poster or a piece of print that we might put out, a flyer, a page within a prospectus, where we take those same blocks of content and we reformat them for different purposes. We can only do this if we really understand the uses of all of our content across the board, what those content blocks are. So we need to deconstruct our content in order to reconstruct it in meaningful ways, and then to understand how that content connects together in different ways. And that then brings us to the solution to all of this, really, that is content strategy. And this is the thing that we really need to be developing in order to underpin a robust digital strategy. A digital strategy should not start with technology. A digital strategy, from my perspective, should start with content. So what is a content strategy? This is my definition of it. For me, a content is the process of planning, creating, distributing and maintaining content in a way that's useful and usable to your audience, but also understandable and adaptable to machines and intelligent systems. So our audiences are getting value out of it, but the technologies that we're using to manipulate, present and create that content are also able to understand what that content actually is so that it can adapt that content in meaningful ways for us. For us to really arrive at this, we need advanced audience intelligence. We need to understand how our audience are motivated in different ways and what they're actually going to do. We need to do that piece of deconstructing our content in order to reconstruct it. We call this content modelling. And we really need to think about what the editorial piece of this is in order to actually be useful and usable. And finally, we need to think about how we actually create and archive that content, from workflow and governance processes to how we actually maintain or even archive that content when it's no longer needed for us. So why do we have this? We put content strategies in place because we want to improve the audience experience. We want to make that content useful and usable for them. We want people to be able to find the things that are relevant to them quickly, and in the format that they want to find it. We want to achieve things like brand consistency. We want to create efficiencies in our content. We want to be able to not have our academics put something in 4 times, but instead just fill in one system and have the technologies and the user behaviours work together in order to adapt and remodel that content in the right way at the right time for the right purpose. And we also want to protect ourselves from the legal issues of having unreliable or out-of-date content, which often comes when we think about content just as individual pages. Whereas if we think about content as content blocks, we can have a system where we only need to update that content once, and it updates automatically everywhere across all of the communications in which that piece of information is used. And finally, how do we actually get started with doing this? We need to think about getting buy-in within our institutions. This is a big piece of work that involves lots of different areas of our work, and it only works really well if we break down those silos. We do need to invest budget in doing this because it is going to require a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of people in order to do it. It helps if it's underpinned by a strong sense of a brand strategy. And it also helps if it's underpinned by a content audit, so we understand what are these content blocks that we're dealing with to start with, so that we can then look at how we can manipulate them in different ways. And the area that we really, really absolutely have to invest in more than anything else is research. We have to be able to develop what we call empathy maps for our audiences, where we're actually properly inside their minds and not just within our own organisational objectives or siloed based ways of thinking about them or putting them into different demographic blocks. And then we need the time and the effort to be able to actually implement this as well, and that can sometimes require restructuring teams within our institutions as well. And thinking about how relationships work between teaching and learning and communications activities, they're not separate. They're very much just one experience to the user. It doesn't matter who's delivering it to the end user. So my advice is that you do this now. You don't need to do it alongside a big web redevelopment project, but I do recommend that as an institution you have your brand strategy nailed down as much as you can, although the process of developing a content strategy can also help with the evolution of your brand strategy and thinking about how you talk about yourselves. I recommend that it's done across the organisation, so across your business school, and not just within an individual team, not just the marketing team, not just the teaching and learning team, and certainly not just the IT department within your institution. And it absolutely has to be aligned to your wider strategy within your organisation. And it really, really helps to take a huge step back, and that's why people often work with organisations like mine to do this, because we kind of have that helicopter view and we're not sort of dug into the institutional structures. But you can create that kind of space for yourself to be able to take that step back and move away from those structures and silos. If any of you do want to hop across to the other side of the world to find out more about content strategy in the education sector, then I'm currently organising a conference on the 29th to 30th of June in London, which is all about content strategy in education. We have speakers from Facebook, from Harvard, from a number of different institutions within the United Kingdom as well. We also have Cornell University. So do check this out, but I do appreciate it's a long way for you guys to go. But follow the hashtag on Twitter. You might pick up some useful tips from the back channel conversations that happen there. Thank you.